Let me tell you something about Rick and Morty that the fan community has been circling for a decade without quite landing on directly. The show is not celebrating Rick Sanchez. This is the misreading that produces the specific and well-documented phenomenon of the Rick and Morty fan who identifies with Rick, who takes Rick's nihilism as wisdom, who treats Rick's contempt for meaning, for connection, for the emotional needs of the people around him as evidence of superior intelligence, rather than as what the psychology research would immediately identify it as. A portrait of one of the most psychologically damaged characters in the history of animated television. Rick Sanchez is not the coolest person in any room. He is not the most enlightened. He is not the person whose relationship with reality the rest of us should aspire to. He is a man in profound, sustained, unprocessed psychological pain, who has constructed an elaborate philosophical framework, the nihilism, the contempt, the performed certainty that nothing matters, specifically to avoid feeling the full weight of what his life has cost him and what his choices have done to the people he claims not to care about. And the psychology research on what nihilism actually is, on what existential anxiety does to the mind that cannot integrate it, and on the specific personality structure that produces Rick's brand of destructive, self-defeating grandiosity, is the most important framework for understanding what Dan Harmon built. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the nihilism. Because the nihilism is the philosophical surface of the show and the thing most people get most wrong. Nihilism, the philosophical position that life has no inherent meaning, that values are constructed rather than discovered, that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human experience, is not presented in Rick and Morty as a conclusion that Rick reached through genuine philosophical inquiry. It is presented as a defense mechanism. The research on existential psychology, and specifically the terror management theory developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski, is the most important framework for understanding Rick's nihilism. TMT begins with Ernest Becker's foundational insight in The Denial of Death, that the awareness of mortality, the uniquely human knowledge that we will die, that everything we are and everything we love will end, is the most destabilizing psychological reality the human mind confronts, and that the vast majority of human cultural behavior is, at some level, a response to that destabilization. Most people manage existential anxiety through what TMT calls cultural worldviews, through the meaning systems, religion, nationalism, legacy, achievement, that provide a sense of significance that transcends the individual's mortality. Through the belief that something about us, something we are part of, will persist. Rick cannot do this. Or more precisely, Rick has encountered enough of the universe, has seen enough of the infinite scale and indifference of existence across enough dimensions that the conventional meaning systems have been rendered unavailable to him. And the research on what happens to a mind that has had its existential buffers stripped away, without developing the genuine philosophical integration that allows a person to live with genuine uncertainty, is directly relevant. The nihilism is not wisdom. It is the specific psychological presentation of a person whose existential anxiety has exceeded his capacity to manage it through conventional means and who has resolved the unmanageable anxiety by declaring that nothing matters. Because if nothing matters, then the specific things that are lost, the connection, the love, the relationships his choices have destroyed, cannot hurt him. Here is the narcissism research. Because Rick's personality structure is one of the most clinically precise portraits of narcissistic personality organization in popular culture, and understanding it changes everything about how the show reads. The clinical literature on narcissistic personality, drawing on the foundational work of Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg and the subsequent research on narcissistic personality structure, identifies two distinct presentations that are often collapsed in popular understanding. The grandiose narcissist, the person whose self-concept is organized around exceptional superiority, who presents with arrogance, with contempt for others, with the specific dismissiveness of someone who has decided that the majority of the people around them are simply not worth engaging with seriously. And the vulnerable narcissist, the person whose grandiose self-presentation is a defense against a profound underlying fragility, whose arrogance is a cover for a self-concept that is not as secure as the performance suggests, who requires the external confirmation of their superiority precisely because the internal conviction is not stable enough to stand without it. Rick presents as grandiose. He performs grandiosity with extraordinary consistency. The contempt, the dismissiveness, the specific pleasure he takes in demonstrating that everyone around him is operating at an inferior cognitive level. But the research on what lies underneath the grandiose narcissistic presentation and the clinical literature on the specific moments where the defensive structure breaks down identifies something that Rick and Morty depicts with unusual clinical precision. The grandiosity is a structure built over a wound, the specific, devastating, unprocessed wound that the show circles around across every season without ever quite landing on directly. The relationship with Diane, with the specific loss that the show implies but never fully reveals, with the version of Rick that existed before the nihilism was necessary, before the defense was built, the research on narcissistic injury, the specific destabilizing experience of a self-concept organized around grandiosity, encountering a reality it cannot accommodate, is the engine of Rick's most significant moments. The rare breakdowns, the specific episodes where the performance stops and something underneath it briefly becomes visible. Now let me talk about Morty, because Morty is not simply the sidekick. He is the psychological foil through which the research on existential anxiety and its developmental consequences is most precisely explored. Morty is anxious, not in the colloquial sense, in the specific clinical sense of a person whose nervous system is running a continuous threat detection program in a world that has provided genuinely overwhelming evidence that the threat detection is warranted. The research on the developmental psychology of anxiety and the specific ways that early exposure to genuinely threatening, genuinely unpredictable environments shapes the nervous system's baseline arousal level is directly relevant to Morty's presentation. Morty has been repeatedly traumatized by Rick, by the adventures, by the specific experiences, the deaths, the near-deaths, the reality-altering events, the specific forms of helplessness in the face of cosmic-scale threat that the research on post-traumatic stress would identify as more than sufficient to produce the anxiety presentation Morty consistently displays. And the research on the relationship between the anxious child and the narcissistic caregiver, the specific developmental dynamic produced when the person responsible for the child's safety is simultaneously the person most likely to endanger it, is the most important framework for understanding Rick and Morty's central relationship. Bowlby's attachment research and the subsequent literature on disorganized attachment, the specific pattern produced when the attachment figure is simultaneously the source of safety and the source of threat, maps directly onto what Morty experiences with Rick. Morty cannot leave, cannot fully trust, cannot fully escape the pull of the relationship even as the relationship consistently demonstrates that the pull is dangerous. This is not weakness. This is the specific psychology of disorganized attachment playing out in animated form across multiple dimensions of the multiverse. Let me talk about the show's philosophical argument. Because Rick and Morty has one, and it is more sophisticated than the nihilism reading that most of the audience has attached to it. The research on existential psychology, and specifically the work of Viktor Frankl on meaning-making in the face of genuine suffering, is the philosophical tradition that the show is in most direct dialogue with. Frankl's foundational insight, developed through the specific experience of surviving the Nazi concentration camps, was that the absence of inherent meaning does not produce the conclusion that nothing matters. It produces the responsibility to create meaning, to choose what matters, to construct significance in the full awareness that it is constructed rather than given. This is the position the show is arguing for. Not through Rick, through the contrast between what Rick is and what the show suggests he could be. Rick has access to everything that should produce Frankl's conclusion. He has seen enough of the universe to know that meaning is not inherent. He has the intelligence to understand that constructed meaning is still meaning. He has the relationships with Morty, with Beth, with the family he consistently damages, that could provide the specific human significance that Frankl identified as the most powerful form of meaning available. And he cannot use any of it, because using it would require him to be vulnerable, would require him to acknowledge that things matter, would require him to risk the specific pain that the nihilistic framework was built specifically to prevent him from feeling. The research on experiential avoidance, Stephen Hayes' acceptance and commitment therapy framework, and its finding that the avoidance of painful internal experience is one of the primary mechanisms through which psychological suffering perpetuates itself, is the clinical description of what Rick does. He avoids, through the nihilism, through the alcohol, through the continuous motion of the adventures that prevent the stillness in which the genuine emotional material would have to be encountered. And the avoidance perpetuates the suffering it was built to prevent. Here is the piece about the Beth and Rick relationship that the research on narcissistic parenting makes most significant. Beth Smith is the adult child of a narcissistic parent, and the research on the specific psychological consequences of growing up with a parent whose love is conditional on the child's function in the parent's self-concept is one of the most consistent and most clinically important bodies of work in the developmental literature. The narcissistic parent does not love the child for who the child is. They love the child for what the child reflects back to them, for the child's confirmation of their own exceptional capabilities, for the child's admiration, for the specific mirror function that the child serves in the narcissist's ongoing self-regulation project. Beth has been performing this function for Rick her entire life. Her identity, her sense of self-worth, her relationship with her own capability, her specific need for external validation, has been shaped by the specific developmental experience of being loved by someone who loved her primarily as a reflection of themselves. The research on the adult children of narcissistic parents and the specific presentations that this developmental history produces is directly relevant to Beth's psychology. The achievement orientation that is connected to the need for parental approval rather than genuine intrinsic motivation. The specific relationship with her own intelligence, simultaneously overvalued and chronically uncertain, that mirrors Rick's ambivalent relationship with the mirror she provides. Here is the piece that the research on the show's cultural impact makes most important. Rick and Morty produced a specific and well-documented fan phenomenon. The fan who identified with Rick, who took the nihilism as philosophical sophistication rather than psychological defense, who used Rick's contempt for emotional connection as validation for their own difficulties with emotional connection. The research on what psychologists call parasocial relationships, the one-sided emotional connections that audiences form with fictional characters, and the specific ways that those connections can either support or impair psychological development, is relevant here. The fan who identifies with Rick is a fan who has found in Rick's nihilism a framework that makes their own existential anxiety feel like intellectual superiority rather than unprocessed pain. Who has found in Rick's contempt for connection a validation for their own difficulty with connection. Who has taken the show's portrait of a deeply damaged person and read it as an aspirational model. Dan Harmon has been explicit that this misreading frustrates him because the show is not presenting Rick as someone to emulate. It is presenting Rick as someone to understand. And the distinction between the portrait of a psychology and the endorsement of it is the most important distinction the show asks its audience to make. The research on media literacy and psychological identification, and the specific finding that audiences with lower reflective capacity are more likely to identify with characters rather than observe them, is the framework that explains the Rick and Morty fandom's most problematic expression. The show gave people a mirror, and a subset of those people looked into it and saw what they wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. Here is where I want to land. Rick and Morty is not a show about how nihilism is correct. It is not a show about how intelligence makes connection unnecessary. It is not a show that endorses the specific relationship with life, with other people, with meaning and loss, and the genuine weight of existence that Rick Sanchez performs across every season. It is a show about what happens to a mind that cannot integrate its own pain, that builds a philosophical framework specifically to avoid feeling what needs to be felt, that deploys exceptional cognitive capacity in the service of emotional avoidance rather than genuine understanding. The research on psychological integration and the clinical literature on what genuine well-being requires is unambiguous on the point that Rick and Morty keeps making across every season, in every dimension, through every adventure. Intelligence without emotional integration is not wisdom. It is armor. Nihilism without the courage to construct meaning is not enlightenment. It is avoidance dressed in a lab coat. And the grandiosity that requires everyone around you to be lesser than you so that your own fragility never has to be exposed. That is not superiority. That is the specific, recognizable, thoroughly researched psychology of a person who is hurt so badly, so early, so completely, that they decided the safest thing to do was to stop believing that anything could matter enough to hurt them. Rick Sanchez is not the smartest person in the room. He is the most offended. And the difference between those two things is the most important thing the show has been trying to tell us for 10 years. If this video gave you a new way of seeing a show you thought you already understood, please like it and subscribe to the channel. These psychological deep dives are what this channel is built for. And every like and every subscription helps this research reach the people who need it most.